The stage was set for what was promised to be an unforgettable evening. The buzz of anticipation filled the air as the cameras flashed, the lights dimmed, and the audience settled into their seats. Tonight, the spotlight would shine on none other than the enigmatic and revered figure, Keanu Reeves. A man whose presence in Hollywood had been both immense and humbling, whose personal life was as intriguing as the characters he played. But for tonight, he was no longer just a quiet hero on screen. Tonight, Keanu Reeves would face the sharpest, most provocative questions that could be asked. Sitting across from him, as poised and prepared as ever, was John Harrison. The host of the evening show, a man famous for his ability to push boundaries and break the unspoken rules of celebrity interviews. Known for his unapologetic probing, his questions could make even the most seasoned stars squirm. But Keanu was not just any star. He was someone who had built a reputation not just for his acting but for his deep philosophical insights, his quiet wisdom, and his genuine kindness. The audience held its breath as the familiar theme music of the show began to play, and the cameras rolled. The host, John, stepped onto the stage, exuding his usual confidence and energy. His smile was wide, his movements deliberate, but beneath his casual demeanor lay the sharpness of a man who was always ready to ask the uncomfortable questions. "Good evening, everyone," John said, his voice carrying through the studio. "Tonight, we have a very special guest. He's not just a Hollywood icon, but a man whose life and career have fascinated millions. Please welcome the one and only Keanu Reeves." The applause that erupted from the audience was deafening. Keanu stood, his face calm but his eyes lighting up with a warm smile. He waved slightly to the crowd, his usual modest demeanor shining through. The applause slowly died down, and Keanu took his seat beside John. John leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Keanu with a knowing grin. "Keanu, it's a pleasure to have you here tonight," he began, his tone both friendly and subtly challenging. "You know, people often talk about you as if you're some kind of myth. The quiet, humble guy who somehow managed to rise to the top of Hollywood without all the usual drama. The kind of guy who can walk into a room and change the energy just by being there." Keanu chuckled softly, his voice smooth and calm. "I don't know about that," he said with a modest shrug. "I just do what I love, and I try to do it as honestly as I can." John nodded thoughtfully but didn't let the moment slip by. "But let's talk about that for a second. You've reached heights that most actors can only dream of. You've been part of some of the biggest franchises, and yet, you manage to stay out of the limelight. How do you do that, Keanu? How do you stay grounded in a world that's constantly trying to pull you in every direction?" Keanu's eyes twinkled as he leaned back in his chair. "I think it's about knowing what's important to you," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with depth. "Hollywood is a world full of distractions, but it's not the world I live in. I try to stay focused on what matters, on the people I care about, the work I do, and the things I believe in." The audience hung on every word. It was clear that Keanu had this uncanny ability to speak simply yet profoundly, as if each word carried weight and meaning beyond its surface. John, sensing the ease with which Keanu responded, leaned in with a more probing question. "But you've also been someone who has experienced both extremes, haven't you? You've seen fame and fortune up close, but you've also known loss and hardship. You've been through things that most people would never wish on anyone, and yet, you come across as this peaceful, centered figure. How do you reconcile those extremes? How do you live with the contradictions?" Keanu paused for a moment, looking down at his hands. When he looked up again, there was a quiet intensity in his gaze. "Life is full of contradictions," he said slowly, his words deliberate. "We all experience highs and lows, joy and pain. I think the key is to accept that they are all part of the same journey. You don't run from the hard parts, you learn from them. You embrace them, because they help you understand the good times more fully." The studio fell into a deep silence. Even John, the master of quick-witted banter, seemed momentarily taken aback by the depth of Keanu's response. "That's incredible," John finally said, his voice softer than before. "But let me ask you something that I'm sure everyone is dying to know. How do you manage to stay so humble? How do you avoid the traps of fame, the ego that comes with being in the spotlight for so long?" Keanu's smile was gentle, and for a moment, his eyes seemed to drift away, as if he were reflecting on something far deeper than the question itself. "I've always believed that fame isn't real," he said quietly. "It's something people project onto you, but it doesn't define you. I try to focus on being the person I want to be, not the one that the world wants me to be. It's a constant practice, but it keeps me grounded." John looked at him with a newfound respect, his usual smug grin replaced by something akin to awe. "That's one of the things I admire about you, Keanu. You don't just talk about being a better person, you actually live it. And I think that's what sets you apart in a world that's obsessed with status and success. Keanu nodded, his expression serene but knowing. I try, he said softly. But we're all on this journey together. No one's better than anyone else. We just have different experiences. John sat back, his eyes scanning Keanu for a moment before he finally spoke again. You know, I've got to admit, I wasn't expecting you to be this thoughtful. I thought I was going to have to poke and prod to get something out of you, but you've got this way of cutting through the noise. It's rare. Keanu chuckled lightly, his eyes glimmering with humor. I'm just trying to be honest, he said with a shrug. No games. John leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly as he prepared to ask the next question. The tension in the air was palpable. He had been enjoying the calmness of Keanu's responses, but now it was time to stir things up a little. He couldn't resist the opportunity to ask a question that would challenge the very core of Keanu's public persona. Keanu, John began, his voice dropping a little to signal a change in tone, let's get to something a lot of people are curious about. You've lived a life that's different from most people's idea of fame and wealth. You've managed to maintain this image of humility, even though you're one of the wealthiest and most well-known actors on the planet. How does it feel to be, well, rich, while so many people struggle? How do you reconcile that in your own mind? The audience waited in silence, fully aware that this was not going to be an easy question for anyone to answer. John's reputation for pressing on controversial topics was well known, and now, with Keanu as his guest, he was finally going to ask about the inequality that surrounded his guest's life. Keanu did not flinch. His expression remained calm and composed, as it always did. After a brief pause, he spoke, his voice steady. I've thought about that question a lot, John, Keanu replied, his eyes never leaving the host's face. Being wealthy in a world where so many don't have enough, it's a hard thing to process, to be honest. I never asked for this. I never set out to be famous, to make the kind of money that most people can only dream of. It happened because I was in the right place at the right time, doing something I loved. John smirked, sensing an opportunity to push further. But don't you think that people look at you, at your life, and feel frustrated? I mean, how do you justify the wealth and the fame in the face of all the poverty and injustice around you? Keanu's gaze softened as he leaned back slightly, clearly choosing his words with care. I think we all have a responsibility, John. Not just to our own lives, but to each other. My wealth doesn't make me any better than anyone else. And yes, I see the disparities, and they trouble me deeply. What I can do is try to help where I can, be it through charities or personal initiatives, and try to make a difference in small ways. But you're right, no one should be okay with the world being as it is, where so many go without. John raised an eyebrow, clearly not satisfied with the answer. He had expected more defensiveness, maybe a hint of guilt or discomfort. But Keanu's calm, honest response disarmed him. It was clear that the actor had given this a lot of thought. That's an admirable answer, Keanu, John said, his tone still teasing. But what about the price of fame itself? You've lived with it for decades now. Has it ever been too much for you? Is it really worth it? Keanu paused for a moment, then smiled faintly. Fame itself isn't the problem, he said thoughtfully. It's what you do with it, how you let it affect you. If you let it define you, you lose yourself. I try to stay grounded, to remember what matters most, being a good person, being there for the people you love, and not letting all the attention pull you in different directions. The audience, who had been holding its breath, let out a collective sigh. They were hanging on to every word, clearly moved by Keanu's sincerity. John, despite himself, was intrigued. It wasn't often that he encountered someone who could answer his provocations so calmly, without getting defensive or evasive. But there was more to ask. John was not one to give up so easily. Let's talk about your personal life, Keanu, he said, his voice now low and probing. You're known for keeping things extremely private. You've been with a woman, Alexandra Grant, for some time now, but she's not someone the public knows. She's not a celebrity, not someone we can easily put on a pedestal. People are curious, why her? Why not someone who fits the mold of Hollywood royalty? Keanu's face didn't change. He knew this question was coming, and he had prepared for it. Alexandra is an incredible person, he said, his tone still as steady as before. She's intelligent, compassionate, and she's been my closest friend for years. It's not about who someone is in the public eye. It's about who they are as a person. I don't need someone to fit the mold of what the world expects me to be with. I need someone who shares my values, who can see beyond the surface. John leaned forward, sensing the vulnerability in Keanu's words. But does it ever bother you? The fact that she's not famous, not someone people recognize? How do you deal with that? Is it ever awkward to be with someone so out of the spotlight? Keanu's smile returned, gentle but knowing. It's not awkward at all, he said quietly. In fact, I think it's the most genuine connection I've had. It's not about the spotlight, it's about how we see each other, how we support each other. She brings out the best in me. And that's more important than any fame or public recognition. John seemed taken aback, his usual sharpness softened by the depth of Keanu's response. The audience, too, was captivated, and the room felt charged with an energy that hadn't been there just moments before. Wow, John said, almost inaudibly. That's unexpected. Keanu chuckled softly, his eyes glinting with a quiet humor. Sometimes the most unexpected things are the most meaningful. At this, John smiled. He knew he had met someone truly different tonight. Keanu's words were a balm to the audience, leaving them with a sense of peace and reflection that was rare in an industry that often celebrated scandal over substance. But now, it was time for the final question, the one that would push Keanu to his limits. The one that John had been saving for the perfect moment. Keanu, John began, his voice lowering for dramatic effect, let me ask you the question that everyone's dying to know. You've lived through so much. You've faced more pain than most people could ever imagine. You've lost loved ones, you've been through heartbreak, and yet, here you are, still standing strong. But, do you ever regret anything? Do you regret giving your heart to someone who isn't in the limelight, someone who isn't recognized by the public? The question hung in the air like a heavy weight, the room falling into silence once more. All eyes were on Keanu, waiting for his answer. For the first time that night, Keanu's expression seemed to deepen. He took a slow breath, his gaze not leaving John's face. I regret nothing, he said softly, his voice unwavering. What I regret is not being able to give more of myself to the people I love, not being able to do more for others. But who I love, who I choose to be with, that's my choice, not anyone else's. And I wouldn't change it for the world. The audience sat in stunned silence. The truth in his words was undeniable, and for a moment, no one knew what to say. John was silent too, clearly taken aback by the depth of Keanu's answer. Keanu, with a calm smile, looked around the room. We all have our own paths to walk, he said, his voice softer now, as if speaking to the audience rather than just to John. And I've learned that sometimes, the most important things in life aren't the ones that are out in the open for everyone to see. It's the quiet moments, the small acts of kindness, and the people you choose to share your life with. John, though known for his cutting wit, could only nod in acknowledgement. The evening had turned into something far more profound than he had expected. The audience was silent, each person lost in their own thoughts, the weight of Keanu's words settling in. Tonight, they hadn't just seen a Hollywood star, they had witnessed the soul of a man who understood life in ways few could ever hope to. The tension in the air lingered long after the last question had been asked. The studio, usually filled with laughter, chatter, and sharp jabs, now seemed still, almost reverent. John Harrison, the man known for his biting humor and quick wit, was taken aback, as if Keanu's words had somehow shaken him to his core. The host's usual confidence was nowhere to be found. Instead, he sat back in his chair, his mind clearly racing as he processed the depth of the conversation they had just had. Keanu, ever calm, seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. His demeanor was still warm, yet the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. The silence stretched on, as if everyone present, including the audience at home, was reflecting on the magnitude of what had been said. Finally, it was John who broke the silence, though his voice now held a different quality, one less confident and more introspective. You know, Keanu, John said, his voice quieter than before, you've completely turned the tables on me tonight. I thought I had you figured out. I thought I was going to push you into a corner, force you to react the way most celebrities do. But you've made me question a lot of things. Not just about you, but about how I look at the world. Keanu met John's gaze, a subtle smile playing at the edges of his lips. That's the thing about life, he said softly. It's easy to get caught up in the noise and forget what really matters. Sometimes, the most profound lessons come from the most unexpected places. John paused, then looked around the stage as if searching for the right words. I think, he began slowly, I think what you're saying is that it's not the external things, the fame, the wealth, the recognition, that make life meaningful. It's the quiet, personal connections we make. The way we choose to treat the people around us. Keanu nodded, his expression serene. Exactly, he said. All the other stuff, it comes and goes. Fame is fleeting. Money can disappear in an instant. But the people you care about, the moments of genuine connection, those are the things that stay with you forever. John leaned forward again, his tone thoughtful. You've lived a life that so many people dream about, Keanu. The movies, the fame, the recognition, it's all there. And yet, you seem to find fulfillment in something far simpler. In relationships. In personal growth. Do you think that's why you've been able to avoid the traps that so many others fall into? The ego, the scandals, the constant pursuit of more. Keanu's eyes softened, and for a moment, he seemed to be looking beyond the set, beyond the audience, as though reflecting on something much deeper. I don't know if I've avoided the traps, John. I think we all face them, in different ways. But what I've learned is that happiness doesn't come from external validation. It comes from within. It comes from being true to yourself and to the people you care about. It's not about what the world thinks of you, but about what you think of yourself. John absorbed his words, the weight of them settling in. The show was no longer just an interview. It had become a conversation about something far greater, about the meaning of life, the pursuit of happiness, and the way we define success. You know, Keanu, John said, a hint of admiration in his voice, I've interviewed some of the biggest names in Hollywood. But I've never had a conversation quite like this. You're not just an actor. You're a philosopher. You've got this rare ability to cut through the superficial and get straight to the heart of things. Keanu chuckled, his smile warm but humble. I wouldn't call myself a philosopher, he said. I'm just someone who's been through a lot, who's seen a lot, and who's tried to learn from it. I've made my mistakes, but I've also learned that life's greatest lessons often come from the most difficult times. John nodded, clearly moved by Keanu's sincerity. The man who had once been known for his provocative questions now found himself reflecting on his own life, his own values. The power of the conversation had shifted the dynamic completely. Sometimes I wonder, John continued, his voice quieter now, if we're all so caught up in chasing success that we forget what it means to truly live. We chase fame, we chase wealth, we chase recognition. But what do we really have to show for it? In the end, it's the simple moments that make us whole, the moments we share with the people who matter, the moments of quiet reflection, the moments where we're just ourselves. Keanu's eyes sparkled with understanding. That's the thing, he said. We spend so much time looking for answers in all the wrong places. But the answers are already within us. We just need to take a step back and listen. John let out a deep breath, the weight of Keanu's words settling in his chest. For the first time, he felt something he hadn't expected, a sense of peace. A sense that, maybe, there was more to life than the constant hustle for success. Maybe, just maybe, he had been chasing the wrong things all along. I can see why people love you, Keanu, John said, his voice full of respect. You're not just a role model on screen. You're a role model for life. Keanu smiled, his expression as gentle as ever. I'm just trying to do my best, John. That's all any of us can do. The audience, who had been silently absorbing every word, erupted into applause. It wasn't the usual applause for a celebrity guest, the kind that was given out of politeness. No, this was genuine. This was admiration, gratitude, and a sense of shared understanding. Keanu had done more than just entertain them. He had opened their eyes to something deeper. John sat back, his expression thoughtful as he glanced around the studio. The usual sharp edges of his personality had softened in the face of such profound wisdom. He had come into this interview with one agenda: to provoke, to challenge, to entertain. But now, he realized that the true power of this conversation lay in the simple truth that Keanu had shared. Thank you, Keanu, John said, his voice full of sincerity, for reminding us all of what really matters. Keanu nodded, his smile kind. It's my pleasure, John. Sometimes, the most important things in life aren't the ones we chase. They're the ones we already have. As the applause continued, the camera panned out, capturing the rare moment of connection between two men from vastly different worlds, one a Hollywood star, the other a talk show host. But in that moment, they were united by something more powerful than fame or fortune. The shared understanding that life's true value lies not in what we have, but in how we choose to live. The evening was winding down, but the effects of the conversation were far from over. The studio, once buzzing with the usual frenetic energy of a live talk show, now felt almost serene. The audience, still lingering in their seats, seemed lost in the weight of Keanu's words. It was as if the atmosphere had shifted, becoming more thoughtful, more introspective. John Harrison, for all his charisma and sharp wit, was not the same man who had started the interview. He had come into the conversation with one idea: to poke and prod, to uncover something raw and hidden. But now, after listening to Keanu's wisdom, John found himself at a loss for words. Keanu, too, had settled into the silence, his calm demeanor unaffected by the intense scrutiny of the evening. There was no arrogance in him, no sense of superiority. Just a quiet assurance, a deep peace that seemed to emanate from within. His eyes, though soft, were filled with something much more profound than the typical celebrity's gaze. It was the gaze of someone who had truly lived, truly understood the complexities of life. "Keanu," John began, his voice quieter now, less sharp, "I can't thank you enough for sharing all of this with us tonight. It's rare that I come across someone who can not only talk about their life, but also make you think about your own." He paused, looking out at the audience, then back to Keanu. "You've given us all a lot to reflect on." Keanu smiled, but this time there was a hint of sadness in his expression. "The hardest lessons are often the ones we don't want to learn, John," he said softly. "But they are also the ones that shape us, that teach us what truly matters." John nodded, clearly moved by the depth of Keanu's words. He could feel it now, the truth in them. The hard truths. The ones that weren't easy to face. It wasn't just about fame, money, or success. It was about the people around us, the choices we make, and the life we decide to live. "Life's not easy," John continued, his voice tinged with a new sense of understanding. "We chase things, fame, wealth, recognition. But in the end, it's the quiet moments that matter. The people we love. The peace we find within ourselves." Keanu's expression softened. "It's funny how we spend so much time running after things we think we need, when the truth is, we already have everything we need inside of us." The audience, still silent, seemed to breathe in unison, hanging on to every word. They had come here to see a movie star, to witness the latest in a long line of celebrity interviews. But tonight, they had seen something else. Something more real. John leaned back in his chair, his eyes now focused on the man sitting beside him. "You know, Keanu, I've spent most of my life being the guy who asks the tough questions. I push people to their limits, try to make them uncomfortable, force them to reveal things they'd rather hide. But with you, it's different. You've got this calm about you. It's not something you can fake." Keanu chuckled, a light, almost wistful sound. "I don't think anyone can fake peace, John. It's either there, or it's not. But I think it's something we all have access to, if we're willing to look for it." John stared at Keanu for a moment, as if the man sitting across from him were someone entirely different from the star he had expected to meet. Keanu was not just an actor. He was a man who had faced unimaginable pain, who had weathered the storms of life with grace and wisdom. And tonight, in this quiet, humble moment, he had shared that wisdom with the world. "Keanu, I think you've made me rethink a lot of things," John said quietly. "I've spent so much time chasing the next big thing, the next interview, the next story that'll make headlines. But in the end, it's all fleeting, isn't it?" Keanu nodded, his expression knowing but not judgmental. "It is. Fame, money, all of it. It's temporary. What lasts are the relationships we build, the love we give and receive, the moments of kindness and compassion. That's what makes life meaningful." John smiled, a genuine, softer smile than the ones he usually flashed for the camera. "You've taught me something tonight, Keanu," he said, his voice full of respect. "Maybe we all need to take a step back and think about what really matters." Keanu smiled in return, a quiet, humble expression. "We're all on a journey, John. And sometimes, the most important step is the one we take in silence, when we listen to what our hearts are telling us." As the conversation came to a close, the studio lights seemed a little softer, the energy in the room a little calmer. The usual clamor of applause at the end of a show felt almost out of place now, too loud for the profound stillness that had taken over. But when the applause finally did come, it wasn't the usual polite clapping for a celebrity guest. It was heartfelt. It was appreciative. It was the kind of applause you give to someone who has shared something real, something that reaches deeper than just entertainment. As Keanu stood to leave the stage, the audience stood with him, clapping louder, as if to thank him for not just being a guest on a show, but for giving them something far more valuable than they had expected. The cameras captured it all. The man who had become more than just an actor, the man who had become a teacher, a philosopher, a quiet presence in a world that often felt too loud. And as the credits rolled, the viewers at home, too, were left with the same feeling. Keanu's words had lingered in the air, like a quiet song that resonated in the hearts of those who had listened. They would carry those words with them, long after the show had ended. Because sometimes, the most powerful lessons don't come from the brightest stars, but from the quietest voices.